Murray Newton Rothbard was an economist, historian, and political theorist that popularized the anarcho-capitalism. Rothbard liked to use a thought experiment to demonstrate what it looks like to put the money printing press on full blast. He proposed that you imagine that there's a genie in a bottle that would multiply tenfold the amount of money that all the people had at that moment. Then he asked the question, would they all be 10 times richer? Well, the answer, according to Rothbard, was not. In reality, no one would be. Everything would surely increase, a rise in price until the tenfold difference or increase balanced out sooner rather than later. Now I ask you, imagine that this money supply that arose from having multiplied by 10 the money of the whole world was not distributed evenly, but that in reality the genie only gave an increase of money supply for some people, leaving the total amount multiplied by 10 but distributed in an unfair and uneven way. Imagine that this increase in money supply goes to the bankers, and they are the ones that will decide how this money will be distributed among society. Then I ask you, who do you think will benefit then? Well, the answer is rather simple: those who get it first. According to Rothbard, this is the illusion of money printing, and that is the problem of having changed the gold standard back in 1971. I'm the first one to admit that monetary policy can be a little confusing and even a little bit boring, but I assure you that monetary policy is incredibly important, especially nowadays. And that is exactly why I put together this two-part series where we're going to learn about what the gold standard was and how this standard was eliminated in 1971, when something that was supposed to be a temporary solution was nothing but a trap that became permanent. We'll learn how that caused an acceleration in the printing of money and then inflation, and why decentralized financial systems are both a need for the people and a threat for central banks. We will talk about the creation of central banks, the digital currency or CBDC, and the striking resemblance between what we're living now and the time when the planet was dollarized. So I strongly recommend you stay until the end of this two-part series. Watch this video and then follow the links to watch part 2, because I promise what's coming up in this series has information that you will want to save and watch a decade from now. Hi there, my name is Hector. If you are new to my channel, here I talk about everything related to personal finance, from stock market, real estate, cryptocurrencies, and even NFTs. So if you're into that kind of stuff, please consider subscribing and also hit that bell notification so you get an alert every time I post new content like this. So without further ado, let's begin the history class, shall we? The machinery to develop a digital dollar has already been set in motion. That will be the digital currency of the United States. The Biden administration's goal is to review the technical requirements and objective needs to provide the country with its own digital currency. The executive order issued by the Biden administration seeks to organize some aspects related to cryptocurrency, or rather just cryptography, because that's a currency that will actually be linked to the central bank. This type of currency is known as central bank digital currency, or CBDC. One of the features of this type of currencies is that they are issued directly from the central bank. So that means that technically citizens can buy them and access them directly without depending on a financial institution. And therein lies the conflict, because this type of issuance hits commercial banks really hard, because basically this type of initiatives have the potential to erode their deposit holdings. Just imagine what would happen if the Federal Reserve launches an app that allows its users to buy and access digital dollars from their phone. That would be cool, but that would mean that people would no longer need having a commercial bank to access or store their money. And that is why most traditional banks insist on the creation of a hybrid digital currency that, after being issued, is distributed from those traditional banking institutions. But more and more voices in the financial sector are warning about the negative impact that something like this would have on the stability of the financial system. According to these voices, a higher demand on this digital currency would put upward pressure on the funding costs of the commercial banks. So the problem is not necessarily systemic, but rather commercial. Think about it this way. If banks take fewer deposits and intervene less in payment routes, they might have access to less information about their customers, which in turn will weaken their ability to evaluate their potential customers. And all this occurs at a time when the system is affected by very large-scale issues. The US federal debt is getting out of control. It just surpassed the $30 trillion mark for the first time in history. And although the US economy is growing despite the pandemic and interest rates are at a very low level, the problem is that the whole situation might be getting deeply entrenched. It turns out that economics is a science that, by reviewing history, is able to identify patterns, events, or anything that helps to understand the present and to deduce part of the future. And in that past, there were moments that marked the beginning of things that later brought about an absolute change in the global financial system as we know it today. Well, this time, it is a technology that has initiated a profound disruption in the system. And yes, I'm talking about digital currencies, a phenomenon that started with the creation of Bitcoin in 2009. One of the main differences between a digital dollar and a Bitcoin, for example, is the way it is issued. While in the case of the dollar, operations are completely centralized and only the central bank can issue that dollar, in the case of Bitcoin, it is totally different and is a complete decentralized operation. Bitcoin is mined by its users and is distributed through a decentralized network. This is a radically different process to the issuance of a currency by a central bank, whether this is digital or not. In the latter, states can issue money without a limit, while, for example, the total number of Bitcoins is predefined by its code, and it might not exceed 21 million Bitcoins. And this is another key difference. Cryptocurrencies, once they are created, they receive their value by the market. From an economic point of view, cryptocurrencies that are native to a decentralized network or permissionless, such as Bitcoin or Ethereum, are not anchored to the value of a legal tender. So, they are subject to the price set by the supply and demand in the market. The goal of this is that not one person by any agency can determine the particular value of the token at any specific time. And because they are not pegged to any fiat currency, they are not guaranteed. Your capital is not guaranteed. Yeah, you heard it right. It all depends on supply and demand. But that is the beauty and the ugly of decentralized systems. Alright, so now let's go back in history, because the conflict now looming between decentralized and centralized currencies demonstrate how public announcement and system-type decisions can have unpredictable repercussions. And here's important to remember the concept of gold standard. The gold standard was simply a monetary system that linked the value of paper money to gold. This system was implemented in the United States in 1834, and it fixed the price of gold at $20.67 an ounce, where it remained for almost a century. The interesting thing about this is that in 1870, other countries followed suit, ushering the golden age of gold. The period from 1880 to 1940 is known as the classic gold standard era. It was also a period of unprecedented economic growth, but the end of this period came with the outbreak of World War I. During this period, many nations resorted to inflationary-type policies to finance the bloodiest war in human history up to that time. From 1925 to 1931, a new era began, that of the gold exchange standard, a version that failed in 1931 after Britain's exit. Because of the massive capital outflows that were occurring at the time, in 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt gave the order to expropriate all the gold owned by citizens and nullified all the contracts specifying payments in gold. As you see, this story has great resemblance to what would later happen again in 1971. At this time, Roosevelt's orders, known as Executive Order 7102, prohibited the hoarding of gold coins, gold bars, and gold certificates within the United States. Gold coins and gold bars were declared illegal, a law that lasted until 1974. And here you might be thinking, hey, I thought it was President Nixon who ended the gold standard. So you might be wondering, who's responsible then? Well, don't worry, because you can still blame Nixon for that, but with some nuances. From 1946 to 71, nations operated under the new monetary system, the Bretton Woods Agreement, a system designed by the US-led Allied nations near the end of World War II as a post-war international monetary order. Thus, the US dollar became the world's reserve currency with which foreign governments could exchange for gold. So governments could do it, but citizens could not. And it turns out that because foreign governments could still exchange their dollars for gold, the US dollar was still technically tied up to the gold that the US promised to redeem at an exchange rate of $35 per ounce. This meant that the United States couldn't inflate their money supply without depleting their gold reserves. Again, let me repeat that. This meant that the United States could not inflate their money supply without depleting their gold reserves. However, the United States did inflate their currency, in large part to finance the rising cost of the Vietnam War and the so-called Great Society. This Great Society was a set of national social reform programs of the US government between 64 and 65. Apparently, that bubble that linked gold to the dollar is one of the main reasons why the United States depleted approximately 55% of their gold holdings from 1950 to 71. In that year, faced with depleting gold reserves and the dollar facing increasing inflationary pressure from government spending, President Nixon made the critical decision to temporarily hold all gold liquidations.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
But like everything they say is temporary in politics is not, Nixon's move became permanent. In part 2 of this series, we will talk about how decoupling the dollar from the gold standard caused big repercussions in the economy in the form of inflation and the way that the financial system works now. So if you enjoyed part 1, don't forget to watch part 2. I will leave a link down in the description. Also, if you appreciate content like this, do me a favor and hit that like button for the YouTube algorithm. It really helps my channel grow and this content get to other people just like you. Subscribe to the channel and also hit that bell notification so you get an alert every time I post new content. Alright, I'll see you in part 2. Bye.